Welcome, everybody, to episode 10 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined again this week by my colleague Bill Roggio.
Hi, everyone.
There's a lot of talk in America these days about endless wars. It's a phrase you'll often hear from people on both the left and the right. It's so common that politicians who are otherwise opposed to one another share some of the same talking points. Take a look at President Trump's Twitter feed, and you'll see that he's complained about America's endless wars more than once. So too have Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, two of Trump's left-wing challengers in the 2020 presidential contest. Of course, both Warren and Sanders dropped out of the race, but Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, has been flirting with the endless wars rhetoric himself. He hasn't been quite so strident in that regard, but he has accused President Trump of not living up to his commitment to quote-unquote end the endless wars. Some or even much of the frustration underlying this criticism is understandable. If you told me on September 12, 2001 that American troops would still be in Afghanistan in 2020, I probably wouldn't have believed you. Actually, I know I wouldn't have believed you. I also wouldn't have believed you if you told me that in 2020 a Republican Secretary of State would come to view the Taliban as America's counterterrorism partner. And as we're recording this, I'm sure that Bill's blood pressure is probably rising just as I bring that up.
It has.
Yes, well, I'm sure we'll hit that once again. In any event,
Thank you, Tom.
Bill and I have covered these so-called endless wars for the better part of 2 decades. As our dedicated readers know, we are often critical of how they've been conducted. Our reporting and analysis have ticked off a fair number of U.S. officials, including recently. There's some behind-the-scenes stuff there that maybe we'll get into in the future. We've run afoul of public affairs officers more than once as well. You know who you are. You're probably listening. But we still think the endless wars narrative is shallow. It's myopic. And judging by some of the arguments I've seen on Twitter, there's often a fair amount of conspiratorial thinking driving it as well. No, neoconservatives, whoever they are not keeping America at war abroad. In any event, why is the endless wars narrative so shallow? Well, it focuses solely on America's presence in various theaters, as if that's all there is to the story, as if America's involvement is all that keeps wars going. Look, America can end its involvement at any time. It's fairly easy to withdraw troops. As Commander-in-Chief, President Trump can order withdrawal of American troops everywhere from Afghanistan to West Africa. A fair number of Americans would cheer that on. That doesn't mean that jihad will evaporate overnight, of course. Far from it. And as Bill and I are going to discuss in this episode, President Trump's predecessor, President Obama, tried to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That didn't work out so well. Wars don't typically end. They are won or lost. Now, the jihadists face many obstacles. Their victory is far from guaranteed. But in some countries, they are closer to victory today than ever. In other theaters, their prospects look dim. We're going to get into that. Whether Americans are present or not, the jihadists will keep fighting on. Yet you don't hear anyone in America today speaking of the quote-unquote endless jihad. We've broken up this episode into 3 parts. First, we're going to do a brief survey of the Sunni jihadi world today, where they're fighting and what they're fighting for. Both ISIS and Al-Qaeda are waging jihad to resurrect an Islamic caliphate. And Bill and I are going to get into sort of what that actually looks like on the ground. Second, we're going to discuss some of the not-so-distant history, how the U.S. already tried to extricate itself from what we call the 9/11 wars. That is, the conflicts unleashed by 9/11 and its aftermath. Third, in the third part of this episode today, we're going to get into some thoughts on the endless jihad in an era of what some in Washington call great power competition. There's this idea in defense circles that only China and Russia matter today. But there's some obvious problems with that thinking. Even though you hear people say China, China, China all the time now in defense circles, there's more to the world than China. Let's get into it. So now, in the first part here, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about what the Sunni jihadi world looks like today. And they're still fighting around the world, and there are many reasons why the Sunni jihadists are still fighting. But the principal one is that they're fighting to resurrect an Islamic caliphate. And of course, we saw this most recently with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, where they actually claimed to resurrect a caliphate. But they're doing this, the jihadis are fighting in multiple theaters with the same goal in mind, and that's often been obscured sort of in America's vision of what's going on. Bill, you and I have covered this for too many years now, but we always marvel at the fact that people don't really understand that the central goal, really, ideological and political goal for the jihadis, is to resurrect a caliphate. Maybe you can start us off by walking us through what that actually looks like and what that actually means for them.
Yeah, and Tom, you're right. I mean, first of all, you made me chuckle when you said "end the endless jihad." We don't hear anyone talking like that, and it's interesting. But that is really the wellspring of where this fighting, where it all began. And the reality is, if the jihadists would just lay down their arms, this war would be over. We wouldn't be fighting. The U.S. does not want to be, U.S. military commanders, political leadership, hell, neither you or I want to be fighting these wars. I'd be more than happy for this problem to go away, and I'd look for a job in another career. But the reality is that's not happening.
Yeah, it's actually just as a personal point, what I think probably people don't even know is that both you and I could have done something with our lives other than this for years.
Yeah.
So, as I'm getting older here, that time is running out. But but the bottom line is that there still were plenty of other opportunities. Don't have to cover the jihad every day of our lives, but we're obsessed with the topic, and there are good reasons to. But what does it look like? I mean, today the jihadis are fighting across the globe, and what does that actually look like, so people understand that there is some connective tissue here. There's quite a bit of it to what's going on and why the world looks the way it does.
Yeah, and the reality is this didn't, the idea of a global caliphate didn't begin with the Islamic State. The Islamic State is an offshoot of Al Qaeda. It's a breakaway faction, so to speak, and Al Qaeda has been very clear from the very beginning that it is fighting to establish local emirates with the overall goal of establishing an Islamic State. So what does that mean? They want to control territory. They want to resurrect the outline of the caliphate. They want to create a global caliphate and impose its harsh version of Sharia. If anyone wants to know what that actually looks like on the ground, the Taliban did a very, very good job of showing us what the enforcement of their version of Islamic law looks like during the 1990s up until the U.S. invasion. And that is just basically a return to almost middle age enforcement of punishments, no women's rights, no democracy, all of that, so that's what it physically looks like on the ground. But what we see, look, that was a problem in Afghanistan pre 9/11. That's pretty much the only emirate that existed. Today, you have the jihad has exploded, right? We have Al Qaeda and the Islamic State are trying to build emirates in 6 main theaters here. You have Afghanistan. That's with the Taliban's Islamic Emirate. Al Qaeda, of course, is backing that, but then you also have the Islamic State's Khorasan province, which is a rival now. It's made up of the Islamic State's Khorasan province is made up of mainly former Afghan and Pakistani, disaffected Afghan and Pakistani Taliban commanders and fighters, as well as some other jihadist Islamic movement Uzbekistan and disaffected Al Qaeda members. They had established a mini emirate in northwestern Pakistan from 2007 up until about 2010-11, when the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan was fighting in there, and they're still fighting for that. They've gone underground due to Pakistani military operations.
And Bill, they even called it an emirate in northern Pakistan,
they did,
right?
Yeah. I mean, look, at the very beginning in 2003. They declared the Islamic Emirate of Waziristan. That's how far this goes back. And again, they were very clear that this was they want to create their states, and then with the overall goal of establishing the caliphate. And that you are correct, Tom. In Iraq and Syria, everyone's familiar what happened there. Al Qaeda, declared an Islamic State. Al Qaeda, created the Islamic State of Iraq back in 2006, 2007, that time frame, and ruled in large areas of western and central and eastern Iraq, in Diyala, Salahuddin, Mosul, and obviously in Anbar province as well. Then you had the return of Al Qaeda in Iraq, which was the Islamic State of Iraq, which ultimately became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and then you had the whole schism between the two groups, right? Al Qaeda still has a presence in Idlib province.
We definitely have to do an episode on that, but that's that's a tortuous episode to prepare for, because there's so many ins and outs and explaining all this, and I'm still following all of it, and I've had about 20 updates I went to write for Long War Journal on what's going on, and it's just maddening because I have to keep changing how I was gonna write. I'm just trying to accumulate the facts, but we got
so complex, and
it is.
And for you to cover that, Tom, I know how detailed you are. It's just so it's tortuous, but it's there, and we know it's there. It's just trying to describe how that looks. That's why I constantly defer to you on this issue, so you could do the heavy lifting for me.
Yeah, well, we have Iraq and Syria, just for our listeners. So we mentioned 6 main theaters. We have Iraq and Syria. You can count them as one theater, or you can count them as two, depending on how you look at it. I mean, basically, from ISIS's perspective, of course, it's one theater, and from the counter-ISIS campaign, it's one theater. But from Al Qaeda's perspective, it's not. It's two theaters. So we have it down as 2 here, just for the purposes of this. But of course, you can look at it either way. But then, of course, you got other ones too, Bill, right?
Right. Yeah, we have Somalia and East Africa, which is driven by Shabab, which is Al Qaeda's branch there. I would argue it's Al Qaeda's most effective and most virulent group or branch.
They're closest. They're probably closest to building an emirate outside of Afghanistan, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they, you had a U.S. general a year ago plus say that Shabab controlled 25% of Somalia. Now that's largely rural areas, but you see how well the Taliban does with holding rural areas. And I would argue that Shabab really is the Taliban of Africa. They operate in very similar manners. They're very effective. They've been persistent. And
they portray themselves that way too. They portray themselves as the Taliban of Africa. Their allegiance is to Ayman al-Zawahiri, and through him to the Taliban's emir Habatul al-Khanzada. That's what their spokesman and the emir both said on multiple occasions. So they very consciously are a Taliban-style emirate that's trying to rise in East Africa.
Yeah, I've always, I've been fascinated by Shabab from the beginning before, at its roots of the Islamic Courts Union. And look, the U.S. has been launching airstrikes against its predecessor, the Islamic Courts Union, and then Shabab since 2006. That's 14 years. U.S. is heavily invested in supporting the Somali government. And yet Shabab persists, and it also operates outside. Look, there's attacks in Kenya and Tanzania and other places, but Somalia is the sort of the focal point for Al Qaeda East Africa, which is the official branch of Al Qaeda in the region. Then you have West Africa, which is just a free for all. Both Al Qaeda and the Islamic State are operating in these areas. And you and Caleb did an excellent, Caleb Weiss, our colleague at the Long War Journal, did an excellent job of discussing the tensions and the infighting between the two groups in an article written last year. I highly recommend.
By the way, this is another theater I was happy to lean on Caleb for that one, because in West Africa it's complicated. I mean, there were reports of cooperation between the ISIS outfit and the Al Qaeda outfits there. I don't think that amounted to nothing. I think there is more to that story. In fact, you see some jihadi sources saying there's more to that story. But they've clearly resumed infighting and have gone at it in recent weeks. So it's another one of those stories where you kind of, to keep track of this stuff, you have to be on the sort of beat for months and years at end. And it's a lot to cover.
And the interesting thing about West Africa is the French are highly involved and vested in the situation there. These are mainly former French colonies, and they want to end the endless wars. New York Times had a great piece on this recently, on how the French wants to extricate themselves but are finding it impossible to do. And the reason is because the jihadists aren't going anywhere. The French will leave. These are weak governments. These are ungoverned spaces, large desert areas that both the Islamic State and Al Qaeda's branch there are able to capitalize on. And it's so, that article was actually, it's funny, when I read that, I'm like, wow, this is exactly what Tom and I are talking about. And
the French intervened, just so people know, in 2012. Operation Serval was what it was called. And the point was to try and eject Al Qaeda and its allies at that point. Were building an emirate in Mali. And that was the idea, was they were building this Islamic emirate. It was modeled after other Islamic proto-emirates. So again, you could see the connective tissue between what they were trying to do there in West Africa and elsewhere. And just the French have taken the lead there with a supporting role from the Americans. But the idea there is that the Western presence is to basically prevent this jihadi nation state from being built, from becoming an established authority in the region.
Yeah, and what's happened since? The jihad has expanded beyond the borders of Mali into Niger and other countries,
Burkina Faso,
right.
Sure.
And that's with French and U.S. intervention. Can you imagine what would happen if we pulled out? And obviously, the last major theater here is Yemen, and that is, both Al Qaeda and Islamic State, to a lesser extent, are fighting basically the Game of Thrones war there, where you have multiple actors. You have the Iranian-backed Houthis, and then you have the separatists, and then you have that rump government, and then you have the Islamic State, and you have the Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has controlled territory twice there. Again, numerous U.S. airstrikes. We detailed this last week in the drone campaign episode, and I highly recommend go back and listen to that. And despite numerous U.S. attempts to decapitate Al Qaeda's leadership, it's Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula still persists there. So, these are the major theaters. There's obviously others. We have like the Islamic State's operations in the Sinai, and we have North Africa and whatnot. But as far as the very, very hot theaters, these are the ones.
Yeah, we've documented too how the jihadis have tried to build emirates in the Philippines and Marawi, where they took over a city. I think the population of Marawi was about 200,000 people, and with a relatively small force, they tried to build an emirate there. One of your favorites, Bill, is the Islamic Caucasus Emirate. I know you have a very disturbing like for the Islamic Caucasus Emirates sort of apparel and their aesthetic. I know you like their T-shirts and stuff. I mean, I think it's kind of actually a shame that they've had T-shirts and apparel, even though they're now look like they're defunct in Chechnya and Dagestan. They have a small outfit that's still going in Syria. It's kind of really on us that basically they had apparel, we don't. I mean, why the heck does the Islamic Caucasus Emirate have apparel and Long War Journal doesn't? But anyway,
yeah, it is one of those questions that really does need an answer. But you got to admit, Ibn Khattab and Doku Umarov knew how to be stylish jihadis, Tom.
Well, I'm not going to admit that, but but if we ever do have Long War Journal apparel, I'm going to push back on the idea that we need to be modeled after the Islamic Caucasus Emirate. But in any event, but listen, we had discussions about all that back in the days too, Bill. I remember both Shabab and Islamic Caucasus Emirate we have on this list here we've talked about. It's interesting how the great extent of great energy that was put in the counterterrorism field to deny that there was an international jihadi ideological component to that where Al Qaeda was invested in trying to build emirates. Now in Shabab, of course, in East Africa, their prospects are looking a lot better than the Islamic Caucasus Emirates, but the idea was basically the same. And you had some people who were very heavily invested in the idea that neither one, until to this day, that neither one of them were really true jihadi outfits. And that's sort of that disconnect the dots paradigm that we've talked about so many times, where people just desperately try and pretend these are all just purely local concerns and not really part of an international jihad.
Yeah, I was always amazed at the attempts to disconnect. Look, I mean, the idea. Look, did the Russians possibly inflate the importance of some of these of the Islamic Caucasus Emirates at the expense of rebel caucus groups? Sure, they did, but it didn't mean they didn't exist. And these groups were, and the Islamic Caucasus Emirate, by the end, was really the primary driver of violence, the primary insurgent group there in the Caucasus. It was conducting terrorist attacks in Moscow and other Russian cities. So yeah, attempts to disconnect the dots on the Islamic Caucasus Emirates from the jihadist brand, it always amazed me. It still amazes me, and it's a classic example of attempts to just try to pretend that these groups don't have any connective tissue.
And, I don't want to get off on a whole tangent here because we're going to move on. But, what's interesting, too, about the Islamic Caucasus Emirate is that the full extent of al-Qaeda's support for the Islamic Caucasus Emirate, or more of the extent, or much of the extent of al-Qaeda's support for it and affiliation with it, came about because of the competition with ISIS, where ISIS tried to pick off Islamic Caucasus Emirate commanders. They did. That sort of competition combined with the Russians' decapitation strikes against Islamic Caucasus Emirates leadership sort of basically left the group moribund and basically defunct to this day. But, there was a huge push from the Al-Qaeda global network to try and prevent ISIS from poaching from the Islamic Caucasus Emirates ranks. And all that evidence is very hard to square with the idea they're just a local endeavor that isn't really part of Al-Qaeda. When you have Ayman al-Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda ideologues around the globe, everywhere from London and Canada to, yes, London and Canada, folks, they have ideologues there, to Yemen and elsewhere, chiming in and proclaiming the purity of the Islamic Caucasus Emirate, it's very difficult to pretend that's just some sort of local endeavor. But, all this goes to debunking the idea, which we still see common out there, that Al-Qaeda was only interested in attacking the West, because ISIS has a presence in most, if not all, the places we just talked about. But what they were trying to do, what ISIS tried to do in declaring the caliphate, was basically compete with the proto-emirates that Al-Qaeda was building in all these areas. And Al-Qaeda was always about establishing these emirates and building the caliphate, and attacking the West was always seen as a step or a tactic toward that goal, as you and I have said so many times, Bill. And, the idea that they're only interested in attacking the West is flat false. Most of their resources, most of Al-Qaeda's resources to this day, are spent in these so-called local conflicts, which are really part of a global jihad. And you can see that ISIS, when they came about and rose to power in 2014, what they tried to do was get basically members of these different proto-emirates and regional branches that al-Qaeda had, and get them to side with ISIS and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and have them throw in with their province structure. Well, the ISIS provincial structure, their provinces, was a deliberate attempt to carve out from al-Qaeda's proto-emirates. It was to basically say, well, al-Qaeda has this long game. They're trying to build these emirates in these different areas. Well, here are the caliphate's provinces here and now. And basically come join us. You can become part of the single unitary caliphate. It was a call that was resisted by al-Qaeda. ISIS didn't have nearly the amount of success in overrunning al-Qaeda that some analysts predicted it would have, but they definitely carved into al-Qaeda's market share, and in some places they definitely ate into what al-Qaeda was doing. But the idea that al-Qaeda was only interested in attacking the West is just disproven by so much evidence that it's really not credible, and anybody who says that really isn't paying attention. But, that idea leads us into the second part of our conversation, Bill, which is that, this idea when you hear with the endless wars rhetoric, the idea is that somehow these sort of bloodthirsty warmongers are keeping the war alive. And if they were just out of the way, then we could just end America's role in all this. Well, we had a President Barack Obama, who for 8 years tried to end the endless wars. He claimed to end the war in Iraq. He said he was going to bring it to a responsible end. That was a big part of his marketing campaign for the 2012 presidential election. That was wrong, obviously. He didn't bring it to a responsible end. He claimed to be doing the same thing in Afghanistan. He said that, in Afghanistan, America's presence is coming to an end. And there was this big push to end America's presence in both those areas and declare that basically being the end of it. We don't have to worry about it. I pulled up a quote from Barack Obama from 2012. And I think this goes to show that there was almost no pushback on the idea at the time. You and I remember this, Bill, the idea that this was truly going to end these wars. We said, U.S. We said then what we're saying now. We're consistent. The U.S. can end its presence in all these places. It's not going to end the jihad, right? This is why the title of this episode is Endless Jihad. Tom, let me give you the quote from Obama, and then we'll go from there.
As we emerge from a decade of conflict abroad and economic crisis at home, it's time to renew America. An America where our children live free from fear and have the skills to claim their dreams. This time of war began in Afghanistan, and this is where it will end. With faith in each other and our eyes fixed on the future, let us finish the work at hand and forge a just and lasting peace.
And that was in 2012, and we're sitting here in 2020, and there are a lot of people who would say that it's, gives some sort of nefarious reasons for why America is still in Afghanistan and still has a smaller presence in Iraq. But the bottom line is, as we just talked about, the fundamental reasons the jihadis are fighting on. That's why. You can say you want to end the war all you want, but that doesn't mean you're going to end the jihad. Right, Bill?
Yeah, it's absolutely correct. Look, I'll just as a quick anecdote, I can't tell you how many times I've heard things like, Bill, you're going to be out of a job once the war ends in Iraq. Once the U.S. withdraws, what are you going to cover? Same thing. I just heard this question the other day. Once the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan, the reality is it's actually going to be more work for us, Tom, because the jihadists won't stop fighting. It's going these wars will get worse without American involvement. Do you and I? Yes, I wish we could end the war in Afghanistan, and I would actually argue we've probably done all we can in Afghanistan, and the presence of U.S. troops there, and it is probably not a good idea, particularly if we don't have a winning strategy or a strategy to advance the interests of the Afghan government. But the point is that wars don't end. I mean, you just don't end them because you say, I want to stop fighting. Well, if your enemy isn't willing to stop fighting as well, that war will continue. Your involvement in it may end. But guess what? That could come back and bite you. I mean, wars are either won or lost at the end of the day. And to say we're going to end the endless wars, it's this narrative to me, it's simplistic. And what I find ironic about it was, look, when President Obama said this 4 years ago, 6 years ago, those pro-military people on the right would call this anti-American, anti-troop, anti-mission, you name it. And now I see the same people saying this is a responsible way to end the war. So I hope that, the irony certainly isn't lost on me, but it seems to be lost on all those making those arguments. And it's, we get into, that's a whole political discussion that I really don't want to get into here. But, the tribalism of politics just magnifies this problem to multiple degrees. And I find it to be, that's how, to me, that's how you know who's serious and who's not serious about these issues, when you see how they react to what Obama said about ending the endless wars, and how they react to Trump about when they say they want to end the endless wars.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see a lot of commonalities, ironically, in what President Trump is saying and what President Obama said, and in fact, we'll get into this in the next part of the next segment of this episode, but, a lot of the Trump posture, war fighting since 2017 has really been Obama plus. It's not really been some fundamental sea change in what's going on, and we'll talk about that. But, just to connect this back to the jihadi effort, this all started with, Abdullah Azzam, an ideologue who had great influence on Osama bin Laden, ruling in a fatwa that jihad was obligatory until all Muslim territory was liberated. And, I've seen some people try and pretend this was a sort of a defensive ruling or defensive jihad. But you look at what Azzam wrote, and I have it here in my library. I have multiple copies of his fatwas. And what Azzam wrote was that basically if even a piece of Muslim territory the size of the hand span, is ruled by infidels, then it's obligatory to wage jihad. So he was saying that even if a piece of ground the size of your hand, if you push your hand on the size of the ground, even if a piece of territory that was once ruled by Islamic caliphs and was once part of an Islamic empire, even if that piece of territory is ruled by a non-Muslim, then jihad is obligatory. That's an imperialistic and an offensive jihad, if there ever was one. I mean, unless you think that parts of Spain should belong to a jihadi caliphate today, which is what he argued, then that's not defensive, And I think the Spanish would probably look a little puzzled if you came to them and said, hey, we have to give over, part of what they term Andalus to the jihadis, But this idea of resurrecting a caliphate, that was part of Azzam's teachings. It's part of the early ideologues, and it's evolved and morphed over time, but it's still with us to this day. And the idea that it's going to go poof overnight because the U.S. withdraws from anywhere is just sort of ludicrous. And it's also strategically narcissistic. It basically says, views everything, and this is one of the problems with the endless war narrative, is that, if America, whatever America does is what's going to define all of reality, and that's just not the case.
It puts the burden on us. If we just stop fighting, this war will end. But as you noted, Spain would have to withdraw from half of its territory. Even and not just a Muslim government, but an acceptable Muslim government, which any of the governments of North Africa, of the Middle East, none of them are legitimate to them. So this fighting would continue in Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria, all over the place. So this idea that it's just the United States that will end these wars by bowing out, it's a simplistic idea that shows just how little people understand what our enemies are doing. And this is something you and I talk about. And this is why we cover the jihadis, not just cover what the Americans are doing in the fighting or the West is doing in the fighting, but what the jihadis are doing and saying. It's important to if you don't understand the nature of your enemy, his goals, his strategy, and his objectives, then how can you wage a war? And that's something that we've refused to do. And obviously we're going to discuss this in the next section. This is part of the failures of the 9/11 wars, or what we call the Long War.
Yeah, actually, we'll talk about it in just 1 second. But one of the arguments that was sort of advanced, and it's still advanced to this day, to try and get around the fact that there is connective tissue to all these efforts, is the idea that these jihadi groups are all just local. It's all local. Don't hassle me. It's local. Or don't hassle me, I'm a local, basically, is the version of the jihad you can see in some analytic circles. And, of course, President Obama had this vision of ISIS, the predecessor to ISIS in Iraq. Now, if you've heard us in these 10 episodes, you've probably heard us multiple times say that, President Bush's decision to invade Iraq definitely opened up a Pandora's box of problems, including opened up the political space for the jihadis to pursue building an emirate in Iraq. And that was the proximate first cause of what you see in the rise of ISIS. However, once the jihadis laid down their roots and were going about building their emirate, sort of the U.S. government never caught up to what was actually going on in terms of its political rhetoric. I mean, there was some in the military channels with the surge and other aspects of it where there was a brief sort of understanding of what was going on. But the political rhetoric never caught up to it. And President Obama actually saw the predecessor to ISIS as a local endeavor. He compared it to a local mafia at one point. And I'll never forget there was this great scene. I wish there was video of it where, and I think it's Michael Gordon wrote about this in his book Endgame on the Iraq War, where General Petraeus at the time, who was sort of a figure that was being vilified by the left, sort of has this debate with President Obama about the jihadis in Iraq. And Obama's pressing his case that it's all local, don't worry about it. And Petraeus is arguing, no, that the predecessor to ISIS has global aspirations. And I think that it's pretty obvious that Petraeus was correct in that regard when you see how ISIS evolved from there, from after the troop withdrawal from Iraq. But you can see that, while not all these jihadi emirates have global ambitions in terms of striking the U.S. today, they are all part of a worldwide movement and worldwide ideology, and in many cases worldwide organizations. And ISIS clearly wasn't going to confine like a local mafia to sort of shaking down people in Iraq. They expanded and were going to expand quite dramatically, and they did. But, Bill, you and I have talked about this a little bit too, and this is part of the mythology based on endless wars. There's this idea that the U.S. military is just, desperate to stay in them. But, we saw, even though Petraeus objected to President Obama's take on all that, and he fought for the counterinsurgency doctrine at first, the counterinsurgency doctrine and that posture was gutted by the Obama administration in both Iraq and then Afghanistan. And there was very little pushback from Petraeus and company and others who dedicated their life to coin. And we don't really see a lot of pushback from big DOD today about getting out of the so-called endless wars. They seem to really sort of endorse the idea, right, Bill?
Yeah, look, General Petraeus, not only did he not push back or resign, he took the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan after Iraq was gutted, and then he took CIA director after Afghanistan was gutted. So, that to me is tacit approval. So, yeah, there is no pushback. You've had general after general acquiesce to the idea that the U.S. needs to leave, and ironically, it seems like only AFRICOM is the only regional command that seems to understand what Al-Qaeda is. I mean, you read their press releases on strikes. They're the only one that puts out regular press releases announcing that airstrikes against Shabab. And in them, they talk about how how Shabab is a threat. It wants to attack its neighbors. It wants to attack the United States. None of the other military commanders or military commands are acknowledging this. And it's really is troubling. The reality is the military doesn't like these wars. They're difficult. They don't show a lot in, it's hard to show progress. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Somalia 14 years later after a direct
and you have erratic political decision-making and political rhetoric. Yep. And the politics behind this. I mean, the military is a function of the political scene in the U.S., and, they're, to their defense in this regard, they haven't exactly had a stable political platform to operate from, with all the erratic. But again, they're not objecting a lot of times either, so...
Look, the military, and the military serves at the, officers and commanders serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. I get that. But if this was so important, why haven't we seen a general resign over policy, over the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Instead, you've had them cheerleading. I mean, General Nicholson, on his way out the door, was talking about how we need to end the war in Afghanistan. That's, if anyone should have understood the importance of the fight in Afghanistan at that time, it should have been him. But he was, he basically just parroted. And look, and the reality is generals who have come through the door, they failed upwards. General Dunford led U.S. forces in Afghanistan. What happened to him? Did he get demoted or pushed aside? No, he became chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. To me, that's approval for policy. They don't have to take them, but the reality is a lot of our military leadership they're climbers. They're going to get that next job. They're going to get that next command and the prestige that goes with it. And frankly, the pension that'll come with it as well. And they're not serving, they may be serving at the pleasure of the President of the United States, but they're not serving the interests of U.S. national security. Somebody needs to stand up at some point and tell people what is going wrong and why this matters. But our military leadership is unwilling to do so.
Yeah, now we have the military's endorsed this withdrawal agreement with the Taliban, which is based on a whitewash of the Taliban. Now going to pretend that the Taliban is our counterterrorism partner in Afghanistan, which we've eviscerated that idea too many times to have to repeat it here. But the idea that the Taliban is now a de facto American ally in what was known as the 9/11 wars is really a theater of the absurd, and basically why I haven't advocated for a continued American presence in Afghanistan for a while, contrary to what you see some morons on Twitter saying, because I can't have Americans, the idea of Americans fighting in a war that nobody really understands and that nobody really endorses, and that the U.S. military leadership, it doesn't even really see the Taliban as it's for what it is anymore, and the Secretary of State Pompeo and others are busy whitewashing the Taliban. I mean, the idea that you're going to have Americans dying in that war sort of strikes me as pretty off-putting. So
the Taliban almost killed General Miller 2 years ago, when they killed General Razak in an attack at a provincial council meeting in Kandahar province. They came he had to be ushered out of the room. Some reports said even had to be hidden behind a desk, and he is kowtowing to them. I mean, you know what? We have a State Department that can do that, but I wish our generals would be generals and stand up for what is right and what is wrong. And it's just, frankly, it's disgusting, and we could talk about this all day, of Tom and I's frustration with the U.S. military leadership and its abdication of its role of fighting our enemies. But we'll move on from that.
Yeah, well, just one other quick point on that. Since the February 29th withdrawal deal, which being obscured in some of the press reporting, especially this week, we saw these brutal ISIS attacks. There's the one in Nangarhar they claimed at a funeral, and then there was one. Actually, for folks who are listening to this, it'll be last week when you actually hear this. But anyway, so last week we had ISIS claimed a big attack in Nangarhar, and then there's this attack on a maternity ward in Kabul. And you can see the State Department real quick, jumps on this and says, we need the Taliban to help us fight ISIS because look at these barbaric attacks. Well, a couple things about that. One, the Taliban, again, this is why the endless wars are really an endless jihad. The Taliban went on the offensive after the February 29th withdrawal accord was signed with the U.S. The Taliban did. It wasn't that the U.S. and the Afghan government went on the offensive. No, the Taliban did, because it wasn't a peace accord. The Taliban went on offensive throughout the country, claiming several hundred attacks, maybe even more, and according to Reuters, executing 4,500 attacks, many of them small, but still 4,500 attacks in 45 days, or more than 100 per day. That's what the Taliban did, but you don't see that in all this reporting and being clearly stated that that's what's going on. Moreover, you had the Taliban has consistently and over and all rejected a ceasefire. The U.S. has been groveling to the Taliban, pleading to the Taliban for a ceasefire in Afghanistan. So has the Afghan government. So has the EU. So have other parties, pleading with the Taliban for a ceasefire. Guess what? The Taliban says, no, we're fighting to win. And so part of the endless wars critique that I think, or rhetoric that we find to be so problematic and shallow and myopic and really just ignorant, is that part of the reason we find it to be all those things is because it doesn't take into account that the jihadis fight on and the Taliban has fought on. And that's the point, right? And that's why the war isn't over, is because the Taliban doesn't want it to be over.
The Taliban's been extreme, I'm not going to belabor this point, extremely clear about what its goal is. Establishment of the Islamic Emirate and installing its emir, Mullah Habibullah, as the leader of all of Afghanistan, which the Taliban says it represents. It's only representative.
And in fact, they call Habibullah al-Qanzada the emir of the faithful. Both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban call him the emir of the faithful, which is aspirations for political rule outside of Afghanistan, despite the fact that they're often portrayed as a nationalist movement, which is, of course, another one of the Taliban apologia talking points.
Yeah, and look, they're telling us this. They're acting in a manner that reinforces this, and we grovel to them. Not you and I, Tom. We'll be the last people.
I'm not groveling to anybody, right.
But the United States, our leadership, grovels to the Taliban. Look, you had said earlier that this is Obama plus. I'll give the Obama administration some credit. It walked away from when the Taliban insisted on
calling itself the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan.
Well, and as well as, no ceasefire and all of the terrible, horrible things in that deal. At least the Obama administration wasn't willing to do that. So there's also some Obama minuses in the Trump administration.
Well said. Good point. Yeah, definitely. Good point. I was talking just purely about what.
In general,
it has the war. I'm talking about the actual war fighting, the actual war fighting policy. But but there's no doubt the Trump administration took took a deal with the Taliban that the Obama administration rejected, which tells you quite a bit about where we're at here. But look, if you listen to this, it's not that we think that the endless wars rhetoric or notion or narrative is without any merit. You and I, Bill, have criticized this thing, various aspects of this for years. We have all sorts. There are all sorts of legitimate criticisms from both the left and the right of this, for sure. But one of the things that we've talked about, which probably is missed, is that, and this is despite the fact that counterfactuals are difficult. It's always very difficult to put sort of what the but-for world would have looked like. But it's possible the U.S. did miss an early opportunity to knock out Al-Qaeda and avoid the whole endless wars, long war scenario, right? I mean, we've talked about how there's this sort of mythology has been built up about the light footprint in Afghanistan and the CIA's Operation Jawbreaker and how this was a smashing success. But it really wasn't. I mean, the principal American effort in 2001, late 2001, should have been to kill Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, other members of the al-Qaeda senior leadership hierarchy, also Mullah Omar, who stood by his man and defended Osama bin Laden even after 9/11. Again, contrary to what the Taliban apologists will tell you. But, they didn't. The U.S. did not get them. They allowed them to sneak out of the Tora Bora Mountains and live to fight another day. And that we've talked about that, Bill, you and I personally, and we're going to have to return to this. I know I keep saying these in these episodes. We have so many episodes we have to return to. We're going to have to return to this one. But that, one of the reasons why this has led to an endless war scenario, or a long war scenario, as we call it, is because there have been a few fleeting moments to have decisive force. This was one of them, and the U.S. didn't do it.
Yeah, Tom, as you were saying this, I came up with an idea. I think we should change our name to the Endless Wars Journal. What do you think? Bad idea?
Yeah. No, maybe Endless Jihad Journal.
Jihad Journal. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Look, Rumsfeld's light footprint strategy was praised by nearly everyone when he did it after the U.S. invasion. But the reality is, I think if history is properly written, it will go down as the biggest, the prime reason that why we are fighting in a so-called endless war. And look, if this was me, I would have put every U.S. air mobile asset, every deployable division possible in the region, the Tora Bora Mountains, and demanded that whoever was there would walk out immediately, or nothing walks out. There wouldn't be a frog, a tree, nothing. A plant, nothing would have survived the onslaught. Would we have lost? See, they were risk averse then, casualty averse then. Instead, what did we do? We relied on local militia to contain them with special forces and rangers and some other units. We didn't have enough. We didn't act decisively. Look. Again, hard to prove the counterfactual, but if Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri and all of the al-Qaeda leaders and operatives did not survive or were captured during that operation, would we have had this explosion of jihad? Instead, they slipped out and they were able to reestablish themselves. And, look, the prestige of surviving Tora Bora was significant.
Yeah, you bet.
So that really is, that's our first criticism of this, and the other one is, for me personally, is, you go shopping and we'll take care of it, but that's a whole nother issue. I always hated that from the Bush administration, or from President Bush himself. But yeah, we are always seen as being cheerleading this war. We can sit down and do 20 episodes on the failures of these 9/11 wars.
Yeah, to be fair, I think there's just a handful of critics who see us as cheerleaders. I don't think most people see us as cheerleaders. I think it's just a sort of, some people I'd rather not address, on Twitter and other stuff,
No,
but
but the reality is it's just frustrating to watch. This is the hardest part of my job personally, is to watch and be able to predict failure and be able to do nothing about it except for to explain it.
That's really our job, though. I mean, we don't have any policy making role, so nobody. Yeah. Very rarely is any policymaker will actually listen to us, on this stuff, especially when it comes to Afghanistan or anything else. And so it is what it is. Yeah.
My favorite character from Greek mythology is Cassandra, and she's widely when someone says someone's a Cassandra, they call them a crybaby. What people don't understand is that Cassandra was given the gift of sight, but she was cursed with people failing to listen. So when the Greeks came to attack Troy, she'd be like, "Don't open the horse. There's Trojans in there," and everyone laughed at her. And then of course Troy falls. So that's really where we've Tom and I have been on. That's not inflating what we've done, but we've explained why the withdrawal from Iraq was a bad idea. We've explained that the Afghan surge was going to fail. We talked about all Pakistan's role and this and that and the peace deal. We predicted what was going to be in that peace deal and why it would fail.
Yeah, withdrawal deal.
Withdrawal deal. Sorry, they've ingrained it. Those headlines ingrained it in my brain.
Yeah.
So-called peace deal. And so anyway, a little venting there, but there's been probably no greater critics of this war than you and I, but we come at it not from an anti-war perspective, but
not from an anti-American perspective. I mean, for all of our criticisms of the way the U.S. military has handled this, that's really what's a lot of driving the endless wars rhetoric. Is there is this reflexive sort of critique of the U.S. military or desires the U.S. military is the prime bad actor and stuff. We see it when it comes to Afghanistan, some of the criticisms. And I'm sorry for all the things we criticize the U.S. military has done. Do I think that the U.S. military was worse than Al-Qaeda in Iraq? No. Despite, Abu Ghraib and other things, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is still the butchers there and did things that were horrendous. Is the U.S. military worse than the Taliban? No. I'm sorry. The Taliban is still a barbaric movement that accounts for more civilian casualties than anybody. So, the whole point is this idea, there is absolutely an element of this. Not saying all of it, okay? I'm not saying everybody endorses, but there is an element of anti-Americanism involved here, too, which is a difficult thing to discuss and diagnose. But it's there. I mean, you and I have seen it. We have some people who criticize us, and their first criticism is, well, they're Americans. Okay, well, what does that mean? So we're Americans, so our opinion doesn't count. Our perceptions of the facts don't count. So this is all a very complex thing. Dealing with all this, but I think anti-Americanism is probably a bigger part of it than I've even let on. But now obviously that's now boiled way beyond that, and is now basically people have just basically fed up with the whole thing, and they just want out. And I can't, like I said, I can't entirely blame them, and neither can you, Bill. I mean, we documented why this thing is not working overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the reality is endless wars is when the narrative is when isolationists meet the anti-war crowd. That's what you get. That's what we have, and it's very frustrating. And the isolationists are teaming up with the people who, frankly, dislike American soldiers and anything that the U.S. military does. They really should consider that when they talk like this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've had other criticisms, too, of the wars. We mentioned Iraq and opening up the political space for a caliphate building project there, of course. But, it's interesting. This is where the political criticisms don't necessarily go. We don't go with the herd because, you can criticize the 2003 invasion, sure. But then, Obama and the many Democrats then dismissed the caliphate building project in Iraq. They then said, it doesn't matter, don't worry about it. I mean, you had John Brennan, who was the counterterrorism advisor to President Obama, call it an absurd, feckless delusion in 2011. That's what he called it, right? So that's a good example I like to use. That's John Brennan went on to become CIA director. That's a good example of how American policymakers and officials haven't taken the jihadis' goals and strategy and political desire seriously. They've dismissed it. It's been dismissed over and over again. When we talk about Afghanistan, we go on and on about it. But what's the central thing, the central assumption underlying the negotiations with the Taliban, Bill? The central assumption is what you have and I talk about all the time, that they don't really want to build an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan, that they're willing to politically reconcile with the Afghan government. Right? Are you aware of any evidence that that's true, Bill? I'm not aware of any evidence. Not real evidence,
If you read what they're telling the world, it's the opposite is true. I mean, you had a fatwa issued 7 days after the signing of the withdrawal deal that the Taliban, it said they didn't fight just for democracy or to share power with the government. They fought to reestablish the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan with Mullah Habibullah as its emir. And look, turning back to the Islamic State. President Obama called it the JV team, and the common narrative on the Islamic State was that it was only waging a local insurgency. Well, how did that turn out? I mean, this is what's so frustrating. Did anyone ever pay a political price or was corrected for making such statements? No. And these types of things, these bad ideas continue to persist, and people continue to get promoted. And back to
let me give you one quick point on that. So then what's the politics of this is all just totally twisted, because then President Trump runs in 2016 accusing Obama of being the founder of ISIS for withdrawing troops from Iraq. But then President Trump himself shows absolutely no patience for the U.S. presence in Iraq or Syria, right? I mean, he then is railing against the U.S., I think quite to our amazement, actually. I think this is one thing I'm surprised at how effective it was to sort of remove the territory from ISIS with such a small American force, well, although it didn't defeat ISIS and they live on as insurgents. But the U.S. had a very small presence in Syria of about 2,000, 2,500, whatever it was, American troops who were basically acting in a support role for frontline Kurdish fighters, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which were really a front for the PKK. That's, again, a whole other episode we can do. But in any event, that working
especially designated terrorist group,
right? Yeah, one of the many contradictions in all this. But in any event, or tensions. But the idea that the U.S. had a very small footprint in Syria and was effective in removing ISIS from its territory and having tangible gains that were caught. Any cost benefit analysis would have to come up saying this was effective, unlike in Afghanistan where maybe more money's been wasted. But you can look at it from that perspective. And then what does Trump do? He gets on, he sort of repeats the Rand Paul points and basically, we got to get out of Syria now. At that point, I think the reports were it was 2,200 troops in Syria, after he himself had criticized President Obama from cutting and running from the fight against ISIS, allowing them to build their caliphate. So it's just, all this is just twisted. I think in another podcast I described it as scrambled eggs. It's very tough to keep your there's no consistent sort of thinking here. There's certainly not an omelet, it's all a mess, and you don't even know what is in the scrambled eggs, So, but you agree with that, Bill, right? I mean, President Trump's criticism of all this there's no logical consistency here in any of this,
No.
And
listen, we'll go back to Afghanistan, right? He criticized the Bo Bergdahl deal, which released the Taliban 5, many, if not all, if I recall, linked to Al Qaeda. He said it was a horrible deal, and what did he do? He cut a horrible deal with the Afghan Taliban. And by the way, the Taliban 5 was on the Taliban's negotiating team.
Yeah, the deal with the Taliban. So not only the Taliban 5 and the negotiating team in Doha, you criticize, but the withdrawal deal between the U.S. and the Taliban in Doha called for the same ratio, the same uneven swap, only in a much greater level.
5,000 to 1,000.
Much greater level, where the Taliban gets 5,000 jihadis in return for 1,000. We don't even know who the 1,000 are that the Taliban are holding. So here not only you sort of, and this is this sort of the ridiculousness of all this, right? The politics of this is just totally torturous. I mean, it's just awful to watch.
Twisted, Tom. It
makes me not want to put American service members in harm's way when I see the politicians of this sort of completely incompetent and illogical and all this stuff. That's basically where you and I are coming from, right? Is that we serve more of the American service member than we do their leadership.
Yeah, I mean, how can I ask American service members to sacrifice their lives for this mess, for feckless political leadership that has no understanding? I mean, it's in a perverted way made me an isolationist, but in a different sort of way. Like, I understand the U.S. needs to use force to defend itself at times. I believe that should be limited. But doing it the way we're doing it, by putting our service members in harm's way we're not looking to win these wars. We're not even looking to...
Well, it's not even that we're not looking to win, but now we don't even have a stable sort of keep them at bay posture.
Yeah,
right?
That's exactly what I was going to say.
The point is,
the words on that.
You look at Syria, and it's just even a support role is not is politically not viable. You
have troops. There was 2 Americans killed in Iraq recently. They're in a support role because we're feckless on the Shia militias there, and it's. That's the real irony of this, is we're often, again, it is a certain bizarre corner, but we're seen as warmongers or this or pro, whatever. Every time we write or say something about the Taliban peace deal, I get the, so what, you want to keep our troops in Afghanistan?
Again, withdrawal deal, withdrawal deal.
Yes, the withdrawal deal. Tom, you will correct me till the end of the...
Yes, no, it is, I see it too, but, this is not, it's not an argument for, keeping Americans in Afghanistan. It's an argument against whitewashing the Taliban and absolving the Taliban on the way out the door. That's the point. The U.S. doesn't have to bend over and be servile and credulous in the face of the Taliban as the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan. And that's what this negotiating process has led to. It's really disgraceful, I think. And you and I have talked about, by the way, when President Obama withdrew from Iraq, Did he seek the permission of the Islamic State of Iraq, Al-Qaeda and Iraq's front group at the time to do so? Did he do that? No, he didn't, right? He just withdrew from Iraq. Now, of course, it didn't work out so well. But the idea that you need the Taliban's permission to withdraw forces is sort of contradicted by both the massive drawdown in Afghanistan we've seen from a peak of about 100,000 to now less than 10,000 today. Most of that withdrawal was during the Obama years. And also the withdrawal from Iraq, where all American forces were withdrawn at one point without gaining permission of the jihadis. But this, leads us to the third segment here. And by the way, just one little note on that last part of this about the endless wars narrative. It's not even that we think that all the left-wing critiques are wrong. Of course not. Senator Elizabeth Warren, during one hearing, I think it was the confirmation hearing for General Miller in Afghanistan, but maybe it was another general. I don't know. They come and go, But Senator Warren at one point read off a list of statements talking about how the U.S. military said that they were turning the corner over and over again in Afghanistan, and that clearly wasn't the case. You and I objected on the same grounds, right? I mean, the U.S. military and President Obama at one point said that they had broken the Taliban's momentum. That wasn't true.
That was in 2000, I want to say 12, or was it 11, 12?
Yeah, somewhere around there. I mean, it all gets murky now. This is the problem with these. That's the real problem with the endless wars, right? We have the same arguments over again.
Their momentum was so broken that 8 years later, the U.S. groveled
begging for a
withdrawal deal. Yeah, exactly. I didn't call it a peace deal there, Tom. I consciously am working on that one.
Well, but that's the point, right? I mean, there are valid left-wing and right-wing critiques of all this stuff. I think what's different about us is we're just not looking to whitewash the jihadis, which you see this constant tension in that regard. You see that constant push to do that. But let's get to the third segment here, because I just teased the drawdown by President Obama during his 8 years in power. And, again, he claimed to bring the Iraq war to a responsible end and then claimed that he was going to do the same thing in Afghanistan. Of course, that didn't happen. But, the third segment of this podcast, in episode 10 here, is about the 9/11 wars in the era of great power competition. And one of the things we've seen in Defense Department circles, defense circles, intelligence circles is this idea that the U.S. needs to pivot away from fighting jihadists in order to counter China and Russia. But, Bill, most of the pivots already happened, folks. I mean, what are you talking about? There's not some massive Iraq-style surge or brief, short-lived Afghan-style surge going on anywhere. What are you looking at? The U.S., again, what the subject of President Trump's ire was this small contingent of American forces in Syria that was backing up local forces to basically to decaliphate ISIS, right? This wasn't 100,000 strong. In fact, we looked up the numbers, and of course, at the peak, there was about 200,000 American service members deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq. As of earlier this year, when I looked at the numbers, it was only about 20,000, if not less, who were deployed in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and now it's even less than that. So that's less than a tenth. Now, of course, there are contractors and others who are amplifying those numbers, who are adding to those numbers.
But Tom, they're not combat troops. I mean, despite the common perception of mercenaries, they're manning chow halls and doing support work on the bases. That's been largely outsourced. And instead of having military mechanics, you got So that's if people citing that number are either ignorant or knowingly conflating the two.
Yeah, and in fact, the contractor strategy for Afghanistan was turned down, right? Eric Prince had this.
It was, that was Prince's idea to actually put in a sort of a mercenary militia, and
Instead, we're going to treat the Taliban as if they're our counterterrorism partner. So it's just how torturous this. Again, I keep using the word torturous, but that's because this is all very difficult to cover because none of it makes any sense really if you think about it strategically. But then of course we also have several thousand more deployed to Africa as well, and they're mostly there to contain Shabab, but also in West Africa to contain the jihadis. But we were looking up the numbers, Bill, and Indo-Pacific Command, according to the Defense Department, has more than 4 times the personnel of any other combatant command, including CENTCOM, which of course oversees the entire Middle East, AFRICOM, which we've talked about. Indo-Pacific Command is already the force posture for the Indo-Pacific Command, which is responsible obviously for China and the surrounding region, is already 4 times the personnel of any other command. There's already this pivot has already mostly happened away from the wars in the Middle East. It's still war fighting going on, sure, but it's not nearly what it was in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think that this argument really demonstrates, not that we'll talk about this a little bit, there's definitely a rising challenge from China, sure. There's ongoing problems from Russia, absolutely. And these are priorities for the U.S., and they should probably be more of a priority than sort of a jihadi group in the long run, right? But the idea that we need to pivot away or end the 9/11 wars to take on great power competition just isn't backed up by the resource allocations that we've just outlined for people. There are already plenty of resources devoted to China. I'm not pining for a war against China. I know you're not either.
Please, no.
Yeah, but I mean, the bottom line here is this seems to us to be more of an argument because in reality, a lot of people in the defense world don't really want to fight the jihadis anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, these wars are difficult to fight. They often show very little progress. They are hard on personnel that are deployed, especially those who are when they are not in a support role. The tip of the spear these days tends to be our special operations forces, and it tears through them, and it's tough on deployments. God bless them. They are, they're heroes of the United States, those you who are fighting at the tip of the spear and are asked to do so at at ridiculous rates, constant deployments. How hard that must be on you and your families is
that's a significant critique of the war in Afghanistan for sure. Too few people have been asked to carry too much of the burden.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a critique of our overall with that 99.6% of our population are don't even know anyone that are fighting in these wars is a national disgrace. So, one of the things that really bothers me about the pivot, right, is we need to show strength against China and against Russia.
Oh, let them have it, Bill. This is going to be. I like this. Go for it. Yes, we've talked about this. Let them have it.
Yeah, so U.S. military strategy used to be that we were prepared to fight one major war against a great competitor, against the superpower, Russia, and then one minor or one medium-sized war. That would be something like North Korea and Iran. What we've demonstrated during this long war, these endless wars, these 9/11 wars, is that we can't even beat a third-rate power like the Taliban in Afghanistan. 19 years we've had a muddled strategy, and we've been completely unable to beat a group like this. Yes, I recognize there's problems such as Pakistani support. Pakistan, a third-rate power, we can't strong-arm them, particularly when they have a power like India on the other side of the border, a natural enemy. We can't partner with them to force the Pakistanis to end its support for the Taliban. No, we got to cut some horrible withdrawal deal with the Taliban. And yet, we think that this projects strength. So what we're actually giving the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and any other, the North Koreans, is a blueprint on how to defeat the United States. These countries know that meeting the United States on an open battlefield is probably a bad idea. Although the Chinese do seem to be closing some gaps technologically. And is the U.S. military really willing to look how casualty averse we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that? Are we really willing to do a hot war? What happens if a U.S. carrier is sunk in the Taiwan Straits? Are we really willing to go toe-to-toe with China on their turf? I mean, it's gone badly for us. And this is what really bothers me. And here's the thing. This might be what bothers me the most. The people who are going to be entrusted in fighting these wars, and I'm not talking you company commanders and battalion commanders and sergeants and platoon commanders. You guys, I know you guys would fight to win. But is your leadership willing to fight to win? They've just demonstrated over 19 years that they are unwilling to fight to win and do what's necessary and stand up to the political leadership. So we're going to entrust them to fight the Chinese? I think if we actually did go to war with China, things would get real ugly real fast. We'd show the dearth of courage and leadership at the top levels of our generals and admirals, and there'd have to be a lot of turnover before we could right that ship. And would that be enough time to do so? So yeah, I'll end my tirade right there, Tom, and let you chime in.
No, I mean, I basically agree. I mean, I've said over and over again, if I were a Chinese general watching the conduct of the war in Afghanistan or any of these other conflicts, looking at the erratic politics out of America, the erratic political decision-making that's going on governing what's known as the endless wars, looking at the U.S. military's lack of consistency in terms of just down to something we focus on all the time, just understanding the enemy, getting basic understanding, basic facts right about who you're fighting. They've gone awry on that regard numerous times. I mean, are the Haqqanis reconcilable? Remember that talking point we had to deal with?
God.
Lord Almighty, and there's all this nonsense you see through the years. The point is, and the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, sorry, not reconciliation, Reconstruction, Segar, talked about the brain drain, And that's one of the other factors in these so-called endless wars is there's constant turnover of personnel from the top, generals leading the war in Afghanistan to support personnel. There's no consistency in understanding who you're fighting or what you're doing, and it allows all sorts of bad ideas to creep in because nobody's been around long enough to remember that it's a bad idea, to know why it's a bad idea, to know how it doesn't match the reality on the ground. And so none of that speaks well to fighting a long war in the future against any adversary, right? None of that indicates that the U.S. should think it's willing to wage a long war against anybody in the future in an efficient manner. And I think if I were a Chinese general looking at this, I would say, you know what? I see a lot of liabilities here that I can exploit because, by the way, all I have to do is set up, a subunit of the Chinese that wage insurgency against American forces somewhere, and just say, they're not really not really answering to the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party, and you have a bunch of apologists who will quickly jump on board to say, oh yeah, don't worry about it. They're not really America's adversaries; they're just local insurgents. I mean, we've seen that.
Those who have been trained and to understand the idea of disconnect the dots will begin disconnecting the dots on any type of Chinese-backed insurgency. I mean, look, you still see this with respect to Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. It's amazing that people can say this when Qasem Soleimani was killed alongside the leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is the group that oversees those militias. And it's, yeah.
And by the way, just for the record, the idea of having any kind of coin doctrine in Asia right now strikes me as probably one of the most horrific things I've heard anybody propose. Right? There was this report by. Have you not been watching what happened to coin against the jihadis? And how we can't even maintain that. And we're now bending over to appease the Taliban, Al Qaeda's oldest and longest standing ally. You want coin somewhere else? It's just, forget it. There was this report issued a while ago about even on North Korea, how this idea was floated. We need to figure out what a counterinsurgency in North Korea would look like. And I just was thinking to myself, why? Who the heck wants to wage a counterinsurgency in North Korea?
With China on the back door? Are you kidding me? We couldn't do it with Pakistan on the back door of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And we're going to and I seem to recall this thing called Vietnam as well, and how things didn't go well. So actually, the counterinsurgency fight went pretty well there overall, but we weren't committed. And do you think we're going to, that was 40 plus years ago, 50 years ago, and we were willing to do things like that. We don't have the political leadership and the will, and people our countrymen aren't wired this way anymore.
No, and this is coming from two guys who, you and I, basically supported more than not the counterinsurgency efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we saw that there was no willingness to sustain it. There was no consistency, and that it was basically, ended pretty quickly overall, and that there was no willingness to sort of keep going with it. And so the idea you're going to transport that somewhere else. There's a lot to say to speak well of counterinsurgency doctrine. Don't get me wrong. The point is that we have no political or military will to maintain it.
I was actually opposed to the mission in Afghanistan because President Obama.
Well, the 18-month timeline, right? The 18-month timeline.
Yeah, exactly. He told General Petraeus, I'll pull the plug on this, and you need to shut up if that happens.
Right.
He's going to make the decision. So I knew we sacrificed 2,500 American troops for nothing.
Right.
That was a purely political move by the Obama administration because they thought that they can beat the Taliban to the negotiating table. That didn't work so well. And 2,500, I think that's the number that died during the surge. It could be 3,000. It could be less. Were killed. And how many were maimed, and how many carry the horrors of PTSD and things of that nature to these days
for no political objective that was accomplished. There was nothing that was accomplished then.
That's what needs to be understood, and that's why we're not willing. The reality is with these wars, we're not willing to do what we need to do. So maybe it is a good idea to end our involvement in the endless wars. But I'm going to say this. Don't be surprised if you get hit back here again or Americans get killed because it's going to happen because they're not going to stop fighting. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I'll leave it with this. One of the few articles I've had rejected in my tenure as a writer, as an incredibly marginal public figure, was an article talking about how Obama's timeline on the surge in Afghanistan basically was going to negate any of the so-called benefits to it. That basically, when you show you're not really committed for any significant amount of time, that you have an 18-month timetable and then it's up. We had comments from Taliban commanders and others saying they're just going to wait us out. There's some revisionist scholars who say that didn't really matter and the timetable didn't matter. No, it did matter. We watched it mattered. For sure it did, But the point is that, the U.S. has had one foot out of Afghanistan since then, really since 2014, even earlier. Has had, 1 foot out of Iraq since then, more than 1 foot out of Iraq, has all but a pinky toe outside of Iraq, It's not like these endless wars are being fought with D-Day style sort of forces dedicated to them. The U.S. has basically settled into this posture of trying to prevent the jihadis, the worst case outcomes of the jihadis taking over and governing territory. But as we're seeing now in Afghanistan and elsewhere, that's no longer politically tenable. That basically even having Americans in a support role to try and prevent the jihadis from building their emirates isn't tenable. And that's the point about all this. That's the point of this episode, really, is that you want endless war. You don't want endless wars, right? Well, I don't want endless jihad. Neither does Bill. And that will have security ramifications for the West going forward, whether the Defense Department strategists, so-called strategists, want to consider that or not. So anyway, I think we'll leave it there. What do you think, Bill?
I think that's perfect, Tom.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening again to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. We really appreciate everybody who's tuning in to listen to us. As you can see, we don't really fit in with a lot of the sort of predominant narratives out there. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. And we will see you again next week.